Warm roof versus cold roof. It's not a difficult principle to understand, but it can be difficult to get right. I went down a rabbit hole researching this, scouring YouTube and consulting with industry experts. And I want to share with you everything that I learned, as well as what I believe to be a worrying oversight in warm roof designs. Let's start out by talking about the different options for a flat roof garden room, starting quickly with insulated panels. Now, if you've looked up in a supermarket, you've probably already seen these. They have a metal external layer, a foam core, and a plastic internal layer, and they come in different depths, which means you can achieve some very good insulation levels. They're also quick and easy to install, they're robust, they're comparatively priced, and they're very depth efficient. So they're actually quite a common option on off-the-shelf garden rooms where the roof and even the walls will be made from insulated panels. But we're not going to consider them for a few reasons. Firstly, because they are intended for commercial applications, they can be hard to source for smaller builds like this. Having said that, you can source them if you look hard enough and you do your research. For us, the real deal killers are the aesthetics. That internal plastic roof looks great in a supermarket, but not really the look we want to go for in an office. Also, all the lighting and all the wiring is going to have to be run externally to the roof because there are no voids in that roof, which is not the nicest look either. But for us, the big deal killer and things that people don't seem to talk about is the sound levels. They're not good sound insulators, so when it rains, you're going to hear the pitter-patter on the roof, much like if you've been in a caravan. So that's a deal killer for us, particularly when we want to do voiceovers and editing in the office. So not going to be an option for us. Let's look at how a cold roof and a warm roof are built, and then we'll look at the pros and cons of each approach. Now, before I go any further, I want to make clear that I'm talking specifically about garden room roofs. While 99% of the information is common, there are some specifics around the edge treatment which are different if you were, say, building an extension. But looking at a cold roof, these are really simple roofs. You have the joists that support the roof, and then an 18mm OSB 3 board on top that makes the top deck, and you've essentially finished the roof. You will, of course, put a roofing membrane over the top, but we'll come to that later. Internally, to insulate it, you'll put PIR insulation between the joists, and you need to leave a 50mm air gap here to ventilate the area. And of course, you need to make sure the front and rear soffits are also ventilated so that it can move through. But the insulation and this ventilation all comes hand in hand with the vapor control layer. So without further ado, let's just add the vapor control layer. And that's the vapor control layer running up the walls, and in the case of a cold roof, along the ceiling as well. And I've just left that flapping so that you can see that it's actually there. And it's important that your vapor control layer runs as intactly and seals that internal warm space as completely as possible, which is difficult when you have to staple it in place and cut holes for lighting and so forth. But it really is important that you put that in place as perfectly as you can, because it's condensation occurring that will start to cause damp problems in your building and ultimately reduce the life of the building. So to expand on that a little bit further as to how that works is, in winter, you've got the heating on, you've got your cup of tea, you're breathing, you're sweating and putting a lot of moisture into the air. Now the warm air can hold that moisture quite well, but cold air is not able to hold as much moisture. So the air moves through, moves through the cracks that are going to inevitably be there. It's going to cool down and it's going to condensate somewhere in the building, which is not what you want. So you have your vapor barrier in place, and as belts and braces, you also have this void here. And you have the vented rear and front soffits, and that works very efficiently because warm air rises. This area is always going to be heated slightly by the internal space and by the sun. So you put your roof on a tilt, you've got this bit vented, it heats up, rises, and it's pumped out the front, and you have a passive pump constantly moving air through this area, keeping it healthy, and that makes this roof a very healthy roof as long as you build it properly. A warm roof, on the other hand, is built a little bit differently, although up to this point it's exactly the same. Your joists and 18mm OSB on the top. And it does need to be 18mm OSB because it's a structural part of the roof that resists any twists and movements that might happen in the building, but it's also a fixing point that we'll be using later on. And then you have a vapor control layer that goes on the roof here. And if you have any doubt what kind of membrane you should be using, I'd recommend contacting the manufacturers, as they're really good at telling you what kind of membrane you should be using for your use case. There's a reason why the manufacturers have multiple different kinds of membrane, and it's not just depending on what your budget is, it's dependent on what you'll be using it for. So if it's a light use case like an office, it doesn't need to have the same level of barrier as a swimming pool or a sauna or a gym even. So just bear in mind what you're using it for and what you need. And actually going overkill can also be detrimental to your building because you do want it to breathe a little bit. You will see people that use a foil fronted adhesive backed membrane, and that's a very good membrane. It's quite expensive, but it is a good membrane. But be cautious if you use that, you do need to use a primer with that. Although it's quite adhesive initially, over 2-3 years that adhesive will break down if the primer isn't present, and it could lead to problems for you. So make sure you're using the correct membrane, and make sure if you're using an adhesive membrane that you're using a primer. On top of the membrane, we then put a timber retaining wall around the external perimeter. And you'll notice I'm putting that on top of the membrane, whereas some people like to run it up the side. Now, I've tried to get some good advice on this, and it seems to be builders say run it up the side, architects saying in this situation just run it underneath. I believe that you should run it up the sides if you're butting up to an existing building where you might have moisture that wants to move back and forth and you don't want that to happen, or you're trying to protect your insulation from damage. But in a garden room where your roof is overhanging your internal heated space, I think that this is a better approach because you're not creating effectively a bathtub internally. It means if it rains when you're building, it will dry off easier. You can manage that whole situation a lot better. And if you ever have a leak in the roof, you haven't created a bathtub. So I think this is the better approach, and it's the only approach you need to have in a garden room configuration. This retaining wall retaining timbers does two things. One is it protects your insulation, and two is it provides a surface to mount your fascias to. Inside here, you fit your insulation. Because of the configuration of a hot roof, you've got much less thermal bridging than you have in this situation, and you can run your sheets out much bigger, which makes it a lot easier to install. You can also run your insulation as thick as you like to achieve whatever insulation level you want to. We then put 11mm OSB on top of that. And there is a little bit of a debate as to whether you should be using foil-backed insulation with OSB or felt-backed insulation. I'm going to go down this route because it's a lot cheaper, and I think it's just as durable as the other approach, and in some ways more durable. But that's a whole debate in its own right. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, I would search that on Google and come to your own conclusions. To secure the roof to the rest of the roof, you've got two options. You could just use a big long bolt that goes through here and out the bottom here. But that creates a bit of a heat sink, which could radiate all your nice warm heat outside and cause condensation inside. And it also has problems because your roof is going to want to expand and contract through the seasons. That means the head of your screw is going to be sucked in to the OSB or pushed up into your roofing material, which could lead to damage. So I would recommend these thermally isolated telescopic fixings, which solve both those problems. You push them in, and screw them down. And then with that, we just need to put on some fascias and then the roofing materials. So fascias first. And with the fascias on, we can then put the roofing membrane on and treat the edges. And then the only areas outstanding are these areas here that still need insulation. Let's look at the pros and cons of a cold roof versus a warm roof. Starting out with a cold roof, the main advantage of this approach is the reduced depth of the roof itself. And if you're limited to 2.5 meters under the permitted development regulations, then this might be the only roof option available to you in order to get a reasonable ceiling height inside. The warm roof, on the other hand, while it's much deeper, it does allow you to have much more insulation, and that insulation is going to work harder for you because it's thermally unbroken, because you can lay full sheets as you build, and that makes the build process also a lot easier. On top of that, you've also got these large voids in here with plasterboard under here, which means you can run wiring and run your lighting much easier. The cold roof, on the other hand, if you were to run recessed lighting, you'd have to cut away the insulation, try and redistribute your vapor barrier so that it ran into those pockets. But inevitably you're going to have less insulation, which means it's going to be a colder void, and you're going to have holes through there to run your wiring, which creates a condensation risk, and it's not ideal. So for those reasons, the warm roof is the preferred option, and it's the option that we want to go for. But I admit, up until this point, I haven't given you any new information that you couldn't get from other videos. But I did try to reconfigure the prop to make things maybe a little bit clearer around the peripheries. So maybe some of you are beginning to see the problem that I see. The problem as we see it is you have a vapor barrier up here. In a cold roof, it's continuous and continues all the way around. With a warm roof, you have a vapor barrier here and a vapor barrier here, and they're completely unconnected. And yet all the advice is that the membrane should be unbroken. And I think this is happening in quite an important area as well, because it's the top of the roof, so it's the warmest and therefore the most humid. You've also got a weak point in every joist where you put that expanding foam. So every one of those is an opportunity for cold to creep through, as is every joist, which is a thermal bridging point. So condensation is likely, I would say, to occur in this location. Now, I admit it's probably not the worst place to have condensation because it won't do as much damage to the building, but you don't want condensation occurring if you can avoid it. So I started to try and think up solutions, and initially the best solution I came up with was to run the membrane up the walls, across the back and around the outside of the building. But from a practical perspective, that's going to be incredibly difficult to achieve. And again, I've not seen anybody doing it that way, so it doesn't seem to be the way things are done. So in the absence of a solution for myself, I started to contact people, and I contacted a roofing company that does extensions and garden rooms and does this kind of work and offers advice. And their advice was, it's not a big problem. It's not a problem. And I thought, well, maybe I'm being overkill here. But then they also stated that the membrane was incredibly important, and they went to the nth degree to put butyl tape on every stud and seal every staple. And I thought, well, those two bits of information don't seem to coincide with each other. Then I spoke to the membrane manufacturers, and they kind of put their legal hat on and sort of fobbed me off, really. So I contacted a garden room specialist, and initially their advice was also, it'll be fine. You don't need to worry about it. But I probed a bit more, and they sort of admitted that, yeah, it does seem to be a problem, and they didn't seem to have an industry solution to this problem. So I worked with them with this problem as well as our particular circumstances, and I think we came up with a solution that fits both. So our particular personal circumstances are acoustics are really important to us. So rock wool is a very good acoustic insulator, and we want to fill these voids with rock wool to try and make it silent in our room. That means the rule with membranes is that you run the membrane on the warm side of any insulation, and that means it needs to run here. So that then becomes the solution to our big void here, and this section here is to run the membrane along the bottom here, which is a little bit more work, but it doesn't seem to have the same drawbacks as we have with a cold roof, in that we can still run the wiring by running the membrane across this direction here, where we know that the wires and the lighting needs to go. And that might mean we don't have the rock wall in certain cavities, but that will be fine. So there it is. There's the problem as we see it, and there's the solution as we see it. But I'm very curious, have we missed something? Do you think this is all overkill and unnecessary? I'm not really sure. I run through the logic and I put on my engineering hat, and it feels like that doesn't make sense to me. So that's why I'm going to this level, to solve a problem that nobody else is solving. But please let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think the best solution is and what you would do in my place. In the next video, I'm going to be outside trying to put a roof on our actual garden room before the rain hits and putting all this theory into practice. We'll go into a bit more detail of the practical side of things and how that works. And I'm actually really excited for it because it means we'll actually have a proper building that's watertight for the first time. So stick with me for that. And until then, cheerio.